The latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNewsGlobal. I am Surya Gangadharan. This evening, we are going to look at something in the context of Ukraine. I'm referring to the SWIFT network dropping Russia as one of its members or subscribers to the messaging network. So, exactly what is the SWIFT system? I have a small graphic here for you to take a look at, which will give you a certain basic idea as to what the SWIFT is and what it does. SWIFT basically stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. So that tells you it's a messaging service. It was set up in 1973 and it's a cooperative managed by a number of banks headquartered in Belgium. Now, prior to a transaction, this is just to give you an idea of how it works. Prior to a transaction, there is a series of messages that are communicated between the two banks or more that are dealing in the transaction just to verify that all is well and that an account exists. And then the process of the transaction is carried through. So basically, it is secure, standardized, and very safe. And now Russia is being excluded from it because it invaded Ukraine. Now, let me bring in my guest this evening. She is an expert on this issue. Dr. Suranjali Tandon is Assistant Professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Welcome, Doctor. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much.
Now, the SWIFT system, the SWIFT network has dropped Russia from the Russian banks, basically from this network. Is this a decision that the SWIFT network takes, or is it at the direction of governments?
So this is, as you mentioned, SWIFT is a cooperative, which sort of is a network of banks which have come together for ease of transaction. And as I see, there is no regulation per se of this mechanism because it's essentially just communication and it doesn't have anything to do with movement of funds. Nevertheless, because it's the infrastructure, there are the G10 banks which sort of look at this system and sort of administer in the sense how it's functioning. They're involved in the process. So when we're talking about the sanction, I see this as an interplay of the countries administering it, their political view, alongside the management sort of aligning with this view to help impose these sanctions. So it's the countries sort of affecting their decision through this management of the SWIFT network.
Okay. So now that Russia has been excluded, what happens? Is it able to trade anymore internationally, domestically? What happens?
That's an interesting question because everyone's trying to understand what exactly the implications of this move might be. Now there are a couple of effects that we will see. One is that removal from SWIFT by itself does not mean an exclusion from global trade and finance. The reason for that is that Russia for the past couple of years has been developing its own sort of messaging system, which is the SPFS, similar to China. What we notice is that there are about more than 300 banks, 400 banks, which are on this system already. And to the extent that these are sizable transactions, the removal of Russia from the SWIFT may not have as catastrophic effect on its transactions cross border. Second is that there are ways to move around this. So, for example, if you go back to 2012, there were sanctions against Iran, and there were countries that worked around those sanctions to transact. So what can ideally be done is to set up local accounts in different countries and then facilitate this transaction. And I think the third and the most important thing is that we need to look at Russia's trade with other countries. So, for example, if you just break down the bilateral trade, you see that EU is in fact one of the most important trading partners, and gas and oil are actually, I think, the blood for most economies to run.
Yeah.
And with cutting that off would mean that it's not just a cost to Russia, but it's also cost to the trading partners. Now, it's a political question as to how many trading partners would, continue to work with Russia economically, despite the political situation, and so that to that extent, the impact may be mitigated of, being thrown out of the SWIFT mechanism, and we'll have to see then what the impact is. What you're seeing today, in fact, the crash in the stock market and the depreciation of the ruble is in fact a consequence not just of SWIFT, I would say. It's all other impacts together, but the pure impacts from SWIFT, in my sense, would be slightly mitigated by all the other means that are available to Russia.
So when you say that, when you say that Russia has an alternative, it has developed its own network. This is independent of SWIFT, obviously, but is it subscribed to by how many countries are we? Do we have a sense of what all banks in which countries subscribe to it?
So at the moment, there are about, I think, about 23 countries which have sort of been onboarded, is what I've seen somewhere. And but in terms of traction, it's very limited. So just to give you a sense, China's alternate system is also quite popular. They've also sort of tried to use it for their transactions between Hong Kong and China, but the number of transactions just don't match up to SWIFT. So if you have, let's say, 2.2 million transactions in a year through their system, you are talking about 8.4 billion through SWIFT. They're not exactly comparable. What it would require essentially is for Russia to work out bilaterally with countries that are important for its trade and financial flows. I just want to mention that even in terms of financial flows, the EU is looking at Russia. So, for example, if you look at Greenfield FDI, the top greenfield FDI inflows into Russia are from EU countries, and so that will also be adversely affected. Now, again, it all depends on the political position that these countries take. Is it that they seize all their relations, economic relations for the moment, and so therefore there will be a standstill, irrespective of the fact that there is an alternative mechanism available for Russia to negotiate with its bilateral investment and trade partners.
Mhm. Now, this is purely between banks. It's not between, say, financial authorities or finance ministries or treasuries. It's nothing of that kind, is it?
No, it's not. So, as you rightly mentioned at the beginning, it's a cooperative which has sort of independent parties, and of course, in the nomination or the election of the board of directors, adequate representation is made of different countries. But at the same time, it's not sort of governed by any particular government. It's just a cooperative registered under Belgian law. So in a sense, it's not as we would imagine a central bank being a regulatory authority, right? So it's not similar.
So the fact that Russia found it expedient to develop an alternative to SWIFT, and you were telling me that even China has something of the same kind. I mean, it does suggest a level of perhaps a lack of trust, maybe, in the fact that SWIFT is headquartered where it is, and it was developed by a cooperative, largely Western banks.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a very valid point because Swift itself, the way Swift is playing out in the discussion shows that it's got its preferences in terms of countries. So, for example, if the G10 sort of are responsible for the oversight, it really means that the G10 are sort of looking at this institution as their own. In terms of Russia developing its alternative system, well, BRICS has been thinking about it for quite some time, and some of this thinking has come from the economic or the political sanctions that have been imposed in the past. Now, this work has been going on for some time, and I believe India was on board as well in the discussions. And I think that it's possible to develop such a system. So, for example, even without other BRICS countries signing up, Russia and China have already sort of gone ahead and they've experimented with it for quite some time. So, for example, in Russia, it's been there since 2014. For China, I think it's been there since 2015. So they've been about 6-7 years, and what they can do is, and it's possible because of the political associations. It's possible that they can further bilaterally cooperate to develop this mechanism. In this, again, I would sort of go back and say that trade is important. So, for example, if you look at bilateral trade between China and Russia, the ties are extremely strong. About a fifth of Russia's trade is with China. So if, for example, they do decide to cooperate on setting up this alternative mechanism, it might just actually work out for them in exploring this opportunity.
So SWIFT, in addition to being a very efficient network for banks to communicate, is also a political instrument.
As it seems from the developments now. So I think for quite some time, if there's been some suspicion with regard to the use of SWIFT, in the sense there are countries that are looking to form their own alternatives. I guess it's also got to do with the dominance or the importance of the currencies associated with the countries that are using the SWIFT mechanism. So in a way, yes, it does signal economic power, if nothing else.
And the system that Russia has developed and even China has developed, does that also imply a move to push their own currencies as for trading purposes and so on, transactions?
Yeah, so since the Chinese system is more well developed, I think that's one to draw the example from again. For example, China wanted to move to this new system also because it made it easier to transact internationally in yuan. And so therefore, I think with I guess swift messaging and creating a more better environment for transacting, in a sense, also pushes for the internationalization of the currency underlying the country that is supporting that mechanism. So it's quite possible that it signals also the interest to take the currency abroad as a method of international transactions.
And is India working also on a separate system, independent of SWIFT?
The only example that I have, or the instance I have of India sort of moving ahead to develop its own, is in the BRICS context. But as I mentioned again, that in the past, especially when the issues arose with Iran, India did find a way to work its way around, and it's quite possible, if the cutoff of supply of oil from Russia matters to India, it's quite possible to develop a similar mechanism of transacting at the moment. But again, it all, as I'd say, is it's a very different political circumstance at the moment. So when a country responds to these sanctions, even in terms of economics, it really depends on what it wants to signal politically. But insofar as just the mechanism is concerned, it's quite possible for India to sort of work around it.
So you would say that this is a convenient device to circumvent sanctions, but maybe of limited value in the long run.
Yeah, so I mean, there are ways and means to work around the SWIFT system. If you go back and see, there was also some criticism because there were breaches even in the SWIFT system, which is likely for any sort of messaging system. Now, it can be worked around, but then again, it really depends on who in the system is willing to transact at the moment. So it's almost like a double coincidence of wants. So all countries that seek to continue their economic ties, irrespective of the political position, may find a way to work around this. And as I said, there are ways to do this, either to adopt the Russian system, which in my view at the moment is expensive. So for example, if you go back and see, the adoption was hindered by the high level of costs, and they were brought down significantly. But unless there are as many people on a network, just like the internet,
Yeah.
You don't get enough traction, and it doesn't allow you to charge, impose lower costs for relaying these messages.
So, when say banks use the SWIFT network, are they charged per transaction, or is some kind of an omnibus year-long kind of thing that they do? How does it work?
There seems to be an annual charge levied, and then of course there is a charge for onboarding. In some cases, I think for corporates, there could be a certain percentage of the transaction depending on the size of the transaction. So there is a cost which may not be prohibitive, may not be actually visible to the consumer at the end of the transaction, but they certainly do exist.
So, a rough idea how much it would cost?
No, I haven't done the mathematics of transacting through this, but yeah, there have been costs which have been put out for Russia. I do not exactly remember them, but the view at least was that transacting through that system wasn't cost effective until a few years ago, and sort of bringing it down has helped a little bit, which is why you have about 400 banks still on that system.
Mhm. And how many, I mean, just a rough estimate of how many banks would be members of using the SWIFT network?
Correct. So there are about 300 banks that are currently using SWIFT. Now, I would like to draw a difference between number of banks and volume of transactions. So at the moment, there is no clarity as to what is the size of transaction which is happening through the SWIFT channel. And I think if those are significant, then you would see quite a bit of hit back from this stalling of the use of SWIFT in Russia. The other thing is that there would be foreign banks which are located in Russia. So in a sense, putting this sanction would also impose costs on these foreign banks being able to sort of transact across border. So how that is going to be worked out is another question for countries that are imposing these sanctions.
So I come to my last question, one of credibility. If a network which has been set up to facilitate transactions between banks and in that sense push, economic cooperation, trade and so on, if it becomes an instrument of political, convenience, then there could be problems in the long term. Could they? Could they be?
So I believe that the economics is almost always related to politics. How it's panned out over the last couple of days, it
Yeah.
seemed that without economic sanctions there wasn't going to be a cost to this war, which was palpable to sort of stall it. And one way to do it was to introduce this ban on SWIFT, and it's yet to be seen how this works out, because even Russia has gone ahead to say that it'll freeze its assets, and so we really don't know what's happening in the ruble market because it's illiquid now. But sort of going back to you're asking of the system having worked in the hands of a few, I guess all economic systems sort of function a certain way. If you look at global trade, a large part of it is denominated in the US dollar, and
Yeah.
that sort of even financial flows are US denominated, and you would expect that any financial architecture which supports this international monetary system would in a sense be reflective of these dynamics. So I guess it all played out in terms of how the international economy looks like.
Yeah. So very interesting, Dr. Tandon. Thank you very much for that insight. One hopes that we never reach a stage where the SWIFT network drops India, because that could have serious consequences going forward. Dr. Tandon, again, thank you very much for your perspective, and glad I brought you into this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And for those of you who have been tuning into this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and keep coming to us with comments, questions, and observations. We welcome them. Thank you and good night.